Welcome to installment number 2 of My Week at the Club, where I bring you my weekly chess games that I play at the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. This week was round 3 of the Evert Siskonen Memorial, and I was on board 1 of the 19 boards that we had this week. My opponent was Dave Thomas. He's from Fitchburg, Mass, and is currently in the high Class B range with a rating of 1753. I'm still at 1971. Dave played white in this game. I had black, and knew I was playing him ahead of time, so I prepared for a line he likes to play in the French defense, the exchange variation, and he beat me with it about a year and a half ago, and I've been avoiding it, but I was ready for it last night. But he had other plans in mind. He surprised me. So for his first move, he played knight f3, which is the opening move of the Reti opening. It's a hypermodern opening, controlling the center from a distance, striking at it, not occupying it with pawns. I replied knight to f6, which is just kind of a fluid, symmetric reply. And then he stunned me. He played rook to g1. I've never seen this move before, and it looks to me like the kind of thing that beginners do, but of course Dave is no beginner. And I was set back right away, and I spent about 10 or 11 minutes of my 100 minutes that I get for the entire game just thinking about my reply to this move. And what I considered was to play h5, because it's clear that he wants to play push this pawn forward to maybe hassle my knight, and I could restrain that. But after looking at it for a long time, even though I get an open file or half open file for my rook, I decided that I'm sort of playing into his hands. I'm playing probably the sort of game that he was thinking about playing when he played rook to g1. So I thought about it some more and thought about it, and eventually came up with what I think is the correct move. At least it's, I think, it's what the engine suggests, and I think it's a reasonable reply in this position. And that's just to play d5, to go ahead and develop in the center and to claim that this is a wasted move, that he's wasted some time making this move. Okay? So I continued on, he continued on with d4 then, looking symmetric. And in fact, I decided that it looked a lot like a queen's gambit, where he's just wasted a move, moving his rook from h1 to g1. So I went ahead and played it, but it's with colors reversed. It's as if I have white and he has black. So I'm sort of the one that's actually a move ahead in the queen's gambit. So I was happy with what was going on at this point. He replied e3, defending that pawn, and I put another attack on it with knight c3, or knight c6 rather. And then he surprised me with knight c3. This is usually in queen pawn openings like this, you like to keep your pawn on the c file here unencumbered, so you can push it forward either 2 squares or 1 square. So this knight sort of locks in that pawn, and what it does is it puts pressure on my pawn here on d5, threatening something like to take my pawn, and then he has 2 attacks with the queen and the knight. Right now I haven't defended enough, but he could chase his pawn forward and chase my knight away, and then maybe my pawn would become weak. What I didn't want to do was to make this move defending my pawn, because then that locks in my bishop, and I have a harder time developing this bishop. So I didn't do that. Instead, what I played was to get the bishop outside the pawn chain to f5. Notice that I'm not too worried about him taking this pawn, because I can get it back pretty easily by pushing my pawn and recapturing it with the bishop. For example, if he takes, and I played e6, threatening to take the pawn, he really has no good way to defend this pawn at this point. It's that if he played this pawn to b4, they would just be lost. So I wasn't worried about that. So after he pinned my knight, then I did become worried, though, about knight e5, because that would put 2 attacks on my knight. It's defended once. It would be easy enough to play my rook over to defend it again, but this knight would be awfully powerful in the center. And so I thought about ideas like dropping this knight back to e7, but I didn't want to. Well, I didn't want to undevelop, and actually tactically it fails in this position because if I played knight e7, this pawn on d4 would just fall immediately. Well, that wouldn't be a good move. So I didn't do that. Instead, I played a more ambitious move, knight e4, with the idea that at least this way, if his knight comes into e5, I can chase it away with f6. And there was a lot of tactical calculation that had to go into that because there are possibilities of queen checks over here. But fortunately, I have this bishop that can defend my king side. Okay, if he decided to attack this knight immediately after my move, I could take his knight, attacking the queen. He really doesn't want to ignore that threat. There is a possibility of him, there's some complications here, but if you go through and analyze this whole line, it actually works out well for black. So I wasn't worried about that possibility immediately after knight e4. He went ahead and took the knight instantly, and I recaptured with the pawn. And so now I have a weak pawn here, which I then expected him to play knight e5 immediately, attacking that pawn. But instead he traded off my knight that was on e4, which I think is good for black, actually. And the idea here now is that if he played knight to e5, I would just go ahead and attack it on e5, because he can't really afford to take this pawn on c6, because my queen can go here, for example, on c7, attacking that knight, and the knight is trapped. It doesn't have any square to go to that it won't be lost. And he can chase my bishop, but it can just retreat. And this knight is going to be lost maybe for the price of a pawn or two. So he did not do that. Instead, he played back in this position. He played an immediate knight to g5, attacking my bishop. That's not so great, though, because I could just drop my bishop back, which really defends my king side squares. And now the knight, it's not clear what it's doing over here. I mean, this queen could come out and attack my pawn on f7, but that's not that great. It's well defended with my bishop. And I can just force his knight to retreat. So something like this, queen out and h6, and now the knight has to go back to h3. So that's just good for black. So instead, after I played bishop to g6, he developed his bishop to d2, which is probably sensible, although it does leave this weak square, this pawn here on b2, which is a factor later on. I continued my development. Oh, sorry. I played b6. He played bishop to d2. I played, in this position, e6, which gains time because it's attacking his knight. My queen, there's a discovered attack on the knight, and it also allows me to defend this pawn, and it also allows me to play the bishop out and get castled. So it does a number of good things. And at this point, I started to feel pretty good about my game. He dropped his knight back to f3, and I took time out to play f6 here, keeping his knight out of e5 or g5. Now, usually this is a weakening move, but with this bishop over here on the white squares, it's not so weak, because that's the pathway along which this formation can be attacked. Like, for example, if I didn't have a bishop there, at some point the queen could come out and check the king, and there might be a sacrifice on g6. There are various attacking possibilities, but that doesn't happen if I have this bishop over here defending these squares. Okay, he played his bishop to c3, threatening at some point to take and then discover an attack along this diagonal, but that's another nice thing about the f6 move, is that it strengthened me along this diagonal, so now my bishop is really free to move, and I developed it to e7. Dave played knight to h4, attacking this bishop, but it's simple for me just to drop it back into that slot, and now the knight looks a little silly over here because these two squares that it wants to use are both well defended. And he agreed. I guess he went back to f3. I took the opportunity to castle, and now that my king was over there, he played g4, threatening to try to open up some lines to my king. Now currently I have the square g5 well under control. My pawn and my bishop behind it, and my queen behind the bishop all guard that square. So he would at the very least lose a pawn if he pushed it, but he might choose to sacrifice that pawn to get an open line toward my king, to get the open g file, or half open g file, going toward my king. So when somebody's attacking you on the flank, the recipe to repel it is to counterattack in the center if you can. And in this case, I can counterattack in the center very well because I actually dominate the center with this massive pawns. And I also have these two bishops that can become very active if I can open up some lines by getting rid of some of the pawns in front of them. So I exchanged pawns. He took back, well, he did not take back that way. He took back with the pawn. Taking with the pawn is a bit of a mixed bag. It restricts my pawn pushes in the center, but it also locks in his bishop, makes it a less useful piece. But in reality, I have nothing better than to go ahead and play an immediate c5 to try to tear the center open more. And of course, that liberates that bishop. He played the queen up to d2, clearly hoping to castle queenside. If I make a quiet move that really doesn't force anything, then he would have time to castle queenside and then have his rooks in the center or attacking down the g file and have a decent game. But he doesn't have that luxury because there's actually a very strong reply that I came up with here. It's actually a pawn sacrifice with e5. And you can see after what happens after he's sort of forced to capture because I had this attack twice with pawns, and there's no way for him to defend it with another pawn. And he wouldn't, if I play pawn takes pawn, he doesn't want to take back with a piece, or he would lose a piece for the pawn. So he captures, and rather than recapturing, which wouldn't have done me any good anyway, right? Because if I take this pawn, he could have taken it with his knight. Instead, I push the pawn and really sort of wreak havoc in his center here. His bishop only has one square to go to. It attacks my queen, which looks like it's good for him. But my queen has a good square to go to. It can play to d5 where it attacks his knight, which is undefended. So he has to take time out then to defend that knight. He did so by moving the queen to e2 where it could defend the knight. But then I could continue on with my attack here. I played c4. This attacks the bishop laterally with the queen and forces the bishop to move again. I sort of expected him to come in here to c7 and to try to help out with the defense of this e pawn. But it's probably not advisable because I can attack it immediately and just get my rook further into the game, and black is doing very well here. So instead, he played his bishop back to his only other square he could go to, because this square was guarded by my bishop, back to d2. I could have played pawn to d3 at this point, and it would have been probably pretty good because I would have taken back with my pawn, and then his queen has to move, and I have some open lines here. Instead of that line, what I did after bishop to d2 was to play my rook over and attack this weak pawn on b2 of his, hoping to get the response that I did. I mean, either way, I mean, if he plays the rook over, that's not too good because this pawn is now pinned, and I could play my pawn up and attack his bishop and the pawn at the same time. That's good for black. The other possibility is that he could do what he actually did after I attacked the pawn, which is to play the b pawn up. And at this point then I played c3, attacking his bishop. So this is really taking control of the dark squares, and what I had mainly in mind was the idea that I would keep him from castling on the queen side, because the bishop probably has to move, well, either back, in which case it really impedes his castling, or where he did move it, which is to f4. And in that case, now this is a very would be a very dangerous place for him to put his king, because my queen could come in on the dark squares and deliver checkmate, or at least some checks on b2. So after he played bishop to f4, I took this rook, which is it did its job. It got the pawn formation to move and weaken dark squares. It's not doing much on that file anymore. I moved it over to e1. Computer thinks that moving the bishop to g6 at that point immediately would have been stronger, but this is still a good move. Dave was nervous about having his king, and rightfully so, his king and queen on the same file as my rook down here. These pieces can move fairly quickly, and I can expose a dangerous pin along that file. So he decided to run with his king over toward the king side. But of course now he's on the same file as my rook that's on the f file, so that's not necessarily a great place for the king either. I did play bishop to g6 here, which is starting the operation of opening up this f file after pawn takes pawn. And after that, he played rook to d1, which turns out it's a mistake. It's not good, but it's in fairness, it's not that obvious looking at the position why that should be bad. It's attacking my pawn twice with the knight and the rook, and looks like that's a pretty strong threat to take my d-pawn. But I have a strong response, which is to play pawn takes pawn here. So that temporarily at least defends this d-pawn, so he can't take it with either the knight or the rook. You just lose it to the pawn. And furthermore, it opens up an attack on the bishop, which is undefended, so the rook is threatening to take the bishop. And if he takes the pawn with either the bishop or the knight, then there's trouble coming along the e-file, trouble brewing along the e-file. So there are multiple ways in which that causes problems. What he chose to do was to take it with the knight, in which case I just took the bishop with my rook. So I'm winning a piece there. It does give him time to play knight takes bishop, and I really have nothing better than to retake it. But I am a piece ahead here, and it looks like there might be some danger to me because my rook is pinned in front of my bishop, or behind my bishop rather. My bishop's pinned in front of the rook by his queen. And so if I move my rook over to the f file, he could simply take my bishop, for example. Or could he? I mean, there's some danger lurking there. So since I'm threatening to go ahead and, well, for example, here's a line I looked at. I thought that it was conceivable that he would play rook over, and threatening, to come here, check, for example, to trade off queens, or at some point to just to strengthen the pin along this file. I could have ignored it and just played rook f8, and if he took my bishop or he checked, either way, actually not so if he checked. If he, well, first let's look at what happens if he takes the bishop. Then this is simply mate. It's a nice little epaulette, or I guess it's not quite an epaulette mate, but a simple mate where his king has no escape squares. It's picturesque. If he instead came with the queen and checked, my queen is hanging. I would be forced to take his queen. I can't lose it, afford to lose it. He takes back with his rook, and now I have a pretty strong attack here with the two rooks and the bishop. So I can take check. The king would have to move over, and now I have a variety of things I could do that are good. One of which, for example, is to play bishop over here, discovering threatening a discovered check. And if he moves his king, then I have a rook checking on d2. There's a mate in 5 or 6 moves here, according to the computer, but I won't take the time to show it to you. So instead of playing the rook over, he played rook to g2 and defended this weak point on f2, which is maybe a reasonable decision, but that gives me time then to play rook to e4, attacking the queen and strengthening myself along the e-file. And things go south pretty quickly after this. At that point, Dave played queen to a6. There might have been some more stubborn defensive moves that could have been played. Oh, there's actually a cute thing if he had, for example, played the queen here to hang around to defend and get out of the way of my rook. That simply loses the queen to the rook check, seemingly sacrificing the rook, but after rook takes rook, queen takes queen. So it's a trade of a rook for a queen. White wouldn't want to do that. So instead, in this position, he played the queen out here to a6. Okay, from a6, it's sort of out of the action. And all of a sudden, the black's attack really springs to life. I played bishop to g5 with the idea of coming in to e2 here and supporting maybe a rook mate on e1. At this point, Dave sort of made the final mistake, although in fairness, it's very hard to find a defense. Actually, let me see, the computer is claiming a 15-pawn advantage for black, so it's the game is basically lost at this point. But the playing pawn to f3 actually allows kind of a cute finish, kind of a little sacrificial attack here, where I was able to play rook to e1 check. He took my rook. Not taking it also leads to mate, and gives up the rook if nothing else. But actually, there's a mate in that variation as well. But he took the rook. I played queen takes pawn check. Okay, and Dave resigned here. And the reason he resigned is because he has 2 legal moves. He could play the king over, rook takes rook check, and now he can block with the queen, but of course that only puts off the inevitable. That was one possibility. And then after queen f3 check, the other possibility was to block with the rook, and then just queen h1 is also mate. So there was really nothing to be done at that point. If you played f4, there were similar sorts of problems. Also, in some of the variations, the bishop can come over here and check along this diagonal, but it wasn't necessary the way that the game was played. So I won. I was really worried. I didn't mention it, but my time got to be a real issue because this was an unfamiliar set of positions for me. And I used up 1/3 of my time over in the first 8 moves of the game, and I used about 3/4 of my time by move 20. So I was getting pretty low on time at the end of the game, but fortunately the position was in good shape, and it got to the point where I didn't really need too much time to think about some of the moves. So on to next week in round 4, and I'll see who I meet on board number 1 on next time, and talk to you then. Bye-bye.